I think so this is kind of getting to the idea of emptiness, right? The other kind of point that's at the core of this stuff, I would say, where
Yeah.
you also tell this story in the book of seeing a weed and not seeing it as a weed.
Yeah.
And I feel like all of these things have in common the projection of a certain belief about an attitude towards the world, an attachment towards certain things. This is a negative feeling, so I don't want it, so therefore it's pain, and we attribute essence of pain to it, or essence of weed if it's undesirable, right? But actually
Hmm.
none of these essences are really out there in the world.
Right. So the experience was, I was on retreat. This was my first retreat, I think. And I was walking through the woods, and there's a particular kind of weed called a plantain weed that had infested a front yard of mine once, a couple of front yards of mine. And so I had spent some time trying to kill it. And I saw it, and I thought, like, why would you try to kill that? It just seemed kind of like, it seemed as beautiful as the other green stuff. And when you thought about it, it wasn't obvious, like, what is the difference? I mean, there are these categories of things we call weeds, but it's not like it says weed in their DNA. It's not like they actually, that refers to some intrinsic feature of them. It's just that different cultures have decided to deem different plants undesirable, and we categorize them as weeds. And what I realized at that time was that we don't just label them. I mean, it's a trivial point. What I just said is kind of trivial, right? Of course, we know weeds are an arbitrary category. It's a label we put on some plants. Other cultures may do it differently. Fine. But what I realized at that point was how deeply embedded in my own perceptual habits the concept of weed was. I really react to plants I consider weeds differently than plants I don't consider weeds. And I also realized, and that's the idea of essence. In other words, there is unconsciously, we carry around this notion of essence of weed. We think of that as kind of a real, there's something about weeds that they all have in common. And again, if you think about it, if you reflect on it, you realize, well, no, it's just a category humans created. But there's also the component of feeling. I mean, that's what I realized at that point, is the extent to which feeling, affect, shapes our conception of essence. Okay. So, like, to take essence of weed seriously in my everyday life, to go around acting as if there are weeds and non-weeds, hinges on feeling differently about them. And what had gone out of me was the feeling of weed. And that made an actual perceptual difference. I mean, it seemed revolutionary that these things I thought of as weeds weren't weeds. So I don't know that I've explained it very well. I spend more time on it in the book, but anyway, the doctrine of emptiness in Buddhism can be described as the assertion that humans are naturally inclined to see essence in things. Like, there's something that's essence of book. Like, all books have this bookness in them. All cars have carness. And Buddhism says the sense of essence is mistaken. All things are actually empty of essence. That's something that we impose on them. And where this really starts to matter is when our sense of essence is related to moral judgments. You see a little of that with a weed. Weeds are things I kill. And the same kind of essentialism is something that we carry into human affairs. So, like, if there's somebody who's a rival, or an enemy, there's a particular kind of feeling we get about them that I think shapes the way we think about them. Our perception of essence of enemy or essence of rival shapes the way we're going to think about them, the way we're going to judge them. And then if you carry this into whole groups, if you make some generalization about an ethnic group or a national group, people will accuse you of essentialism. And that's a good term, because what you're doing is attributing an essence, not just to one person, which Buddhists would say is mistaken in the first place, but to a whole category of people. And this kind of perception of essence can be consequential, can lead to mass killing and death and so on. And it's in this realm that I think is the strongest argument for, wanting to get clear about essence and not kind of being the slave of falsely perceived essence.
Yeah, I think especially in that social kind of situation, that's a really interesting thing to link it to, because the insight that essences don't actually exist out there in the world, we feel that's the case. We feel things have their own essences, but what's really going on is it's always a projection. It's always, as you said, there's feelings going on in you. You have some attachment to how you feel about them, and your perception is clouded, and kind of filtered with those emotions. And so in the case of genocides, it's, you have one group of people projecting whatever their emotional issues are effectively onto this fantasy of essence of someone of this population. But it applies to all perception, I would say. Essences genuinely don't exist. I completely agree with that teaching. And we do some kind of pattern recognition. Like I might notice there's some pattern that I label James, but then I think the flaw is we imbue that, instead of recognizing that it's a pattern, we hold on to its solidity, and then we get ideas like, well, maybe there's a soul that can exist beyond the death of the body. Maybe James isn't just a process that I label. Maybe he really is a soul inhabiting this physical body. And from the scientific perspective, that's now not a kind of, I would say, a clear way of understanding what we really are. But you really I think you talk a lot about.
I would say that I would say I think the phenomenon of consciousness, subjective experience, the fact that it's like something to be alive, is sufficiently mysterious that I have no idea about what to say about like souls and stuff. I'm not dismissive of various ideas that may seem far-fetched. I don't embrace them. I think very few people understand how deeply perplexed anyone who sees the mind-body problem clearly should be. Okay. And so I still think I am not among those like Dan Dennett who think like, oh, well, the mystery of consciousness is solved. So I kind of, and the way Dan gets there, I think, is he actually believes consciousness doesn't exist, which I think is crazy, but we needn't get sidetracked there. The main thing I want to say is that when it comes to essence, I think evolutionary psychology really, and emptiness, the idea that essence isn't real, I think evolutionary psychology has something really to add at a couple of levels. One is an argument, I defend the idea of emptiness from what I think is a new kind of angle, arguing that because essence is constructed via affect, and because we now know that our brains, as created by natural selection, don't deploy affect in ways that are necessarily clarifying or ways that correspond to the truth, we should mistrust our sense of essence. It is shaped by a process that did not have clear perception at the top of its agenda. It just had getting genes in the next generation at the top of its agenda. But there's, to get back to the issue of attributing essence to people, there's a separate contribution that I think psychology, not just evolutionary psychology, has to offer, although what I'm about to say certainly makes sense in terms of evolutionary psychology. And it's this, I think the most underrated cognitive bias in importance is attribution error, okay? And I think this explains a lot of how we impute essence to people. The original idea of attribution error, before it was kind of elaborated and evolved a little, was that when we ask ourselves why people did things, let's say you see somebody who's rude to the clerk at a checkout counter. You can either say, well, that person's a jerk, that's the kind of person they are. Or you can say, well, that person had a bad day, or that person is, you know, just found out they have cancer or something. You can either have an explanation that is fundamentally about their disposition, the kind of person they are, or about their situation, about the circumstances impinging on them. And they used to think that in general, we attribute too much to disposition and don't pay enough attention to the way situation influences behavior. But they studied it more and they realized that it's subtler than that. The way it works is that for our friends and allies, if they do something good, we're inclined to attribute it to their disposition of the kind of people they are. If they do something bad, we're inclined to attribute it to circumstance, you know, like if it's your kid, they didn't get their nap, or peer group pressure made them misbehave or whatever. But if it's an enemy or rival, it's the opposite. They do something bad and we say, yeah, that's the kind of person they are. They do something good and we say, well, they're just showing off in front of a particular person, whatever. And so that cognitive bias, attribution error, leads us to attribute different kinds of essences to people, depending on whether they fit into our life as allies and friends, or we think at first blush they're more like enemies or rivals. And then that mechanism kind of preserves, you can see how it would preserve this conception of us, of our friends, as being just better, having, you know, essence of goodness to an extent that our enemies and rivals don't. And I just think this is what gets us into wars. It's the reason people who want us to invade countries start out by demonizing the leader, because once we've got them in that evil person box, there's no way they can get out. If they do something good, we'll say, well, that's not the real them. And they do something bad and we say, that's the real them. Once we have framed them as enemies, we are thinking of their essence in a certain way, and human psychology is designed to preserve that sense of essence. So that's my sermon on attribution error.